Good evening and welcome. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, the place now known as Sydney, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be with us this evening. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and it is my pleasure this evening to host this, the final History Matters for 2020. We'll have lots of time for questions at the end, so if you have questions for either of our speakers this evening, please use the chat feature through Zoom and those questions will be answered after each presentation. History Matters is a collaboration between the State Library of New South Wales, the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and the ACT, and the Oral History Association of New South Wales. And your host tonight is the President of the Oral History Association New South Wales, Maria Savvidis. Thanks so much, Maria.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everyone. I want to acknowledge the Wangal and Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the unceded land where I live and work, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that oral history has been a prominent feature of knowledge, storytelling, history, survival and culture in this country for millennia. We know of oral history's power to reclaim history for those that were underrepresented or all too often left out entirely of history's pages. Tonight, we will look at how oral history contributes to the modern and diverse histories of migration and migrant communities in a country where a third of the population were born overseas. As Rachel said, I encourage you to use the chat function to submit any questions you think of along the way, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to ask our presenters more. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Anisa Puri. She's a professional historian and a PhD candidate from Monash University. Her current research uses oral history interviews to examine memories of youth migration to post-war Australia between 1946 and 1973. Anisa is the co-author of Australian Lives, An Intimate History with Alistair Thomson, and a joint winner of the 2019 Oral History Australia Media Prize with Shirleene Robinson. She's worked on a number of large-scale national oral history projects and has held appointments in the heritage industry, specialising in heritage interpretation and exhibition development. She's also past president of Oral History New South Wales. Thank you, Anisa.
Thanks, Maria, and hi, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people here with us today. I'd also like to thank the State Library of New South Wales, the PHA and Oral History New South Wales for the invitation to be here in conversation with you all tonight. So I'll first discuss what oral histories can contribute to migration histories, and I'll then reflect on the types of oral history interviews historians use in their research. Some of what I'll be sharing is also relevant to oral history beyond a focus on migration. As Maria said, I'm currently finishing a PhD project that examines youth migration to post-war Australia between 1946 and 1973, that mainly draws on life story interviews recorded by the Australian Generations Oral History Project between 2011 and 2015. And that work informs what I'll share with you tonight. Firstly, oral histories add the personal perspective. They illuminate how big picture histories about topics like post-war immigration play out in individual lives. Oral histories highlight how a complex interplay of really unique personal circumstances affected by gender, ethnicity, social class, age, and other factors shape individuals' experiences of migration. While oral histories enable historians to identify patterns across time and see commonalities in experience, they also force historians to resist generalizations and to recognize the specificity of individual experience. Interviews offer complexity, and this complexity enables historians to challenge ideas about the migrant experience as the singular experience, to untangle how individual experiences relate to dominant narratives about migration, and to offer nuanced understandings of how migration is actually experienced. Oral histories enable historians to privilege, amplify, and center migrants' own voices while adding historical interpretation. Oral histories also offer insight into the emotionality of migration experience. Orality is important here. The characteristics of the voice, from pitch to tone to pace to volume, offer other layers of meaning that historians can examine to think about how migration unfolded and how it felt and how it feels now. Of course, oral histories tell us about how migration has been remembered. What interviewees choose to include and exclude can help historians consider what factors interviewees most want to share. Oral histories provide us with the opportunity to consider the factors that shape how migration is remembered. What topics are emphasized, which aspects are overlooked, and what might this reveal about how the interviewee understands their own experience? How might the broader social, historical, and cultural context at the time of the event and at the time of the remembering have influenced how they make sense and story out of their own lives? Oral historian Alessandra Portelli explains that interviewees consciously think about how they're presenting themselves during an interview. What can we learn from the image of themselves that interviewees wish to share? Many of the men's interviews I'm working with emphasize their working careers and their contributions to Australia. The fact that these young men arrived in Australia at a time when male migrants were primarily perceived as workers by the state and faced enormous pressure to demonstrate their value and contribution shapes their memories. The persistence of public and political rhetoric about migrants needing to make valuable contributions that benefit Australia, and the prevalence of an enduring national cultural narrative about migrant success also likely influence how experiences of hard work upon arrival are recalled. In the interviews I'm working with, many interviewees also adopt the thinking behind and the language of the Australian government's immigration policies at the various times of their arrival, from assimilation to multiculturalism, to explain their own experiences. Oral histories are always about the relationship between the past and the present. They tell us as much about migrants' experiences decades after they arrived and about their current lives as they do about their experiences at the time of their initial migration. Whether my interviewees talk about you Australians or we Australians, for instance, gives us insight into how they see their own relationship to Australians and the extent to which they think of post-war migrants like themselves as Australians. And it also shows how a small detail, like a personal pronoun, can be so illuminating in an oral history interview. Oral histories help historians tell difficult and unsettling narratives about migration. They can enable historians to venture beyond celebratory narratives about contribution and success, and to consider stories that are harder to hear, sometimes. Rachel Ankeny and Karen Agata, for instance, do this really skillfully in their findings from their Hostel Stories Adelaide Oral History Project, in which they write about how they encountered prejudicial and racist attitudes in interviews with migrants. And these sorts of attitudes come up in some of my interviews too. And while it's a careful ethical balance, these parts of migrants' accounts offer historians the opportunity to grapple with what such attitudes might tell us about post-war migration experience. So I'll now move on to the value of a life story interview when doing migration history. Life story interviews capture the breadth of an individual's whole life experience rather than exclusively focusing the interview around a particular topic. They allow historians to contextualize migration experience within the broader context of an individual's life. Life story interviews show the interconnectedness of life before and after migration, and they help us identify change and continuity. They highlight how childhood experiences influence migration experiences and how later life experiences after arrival can reframe how interviewees understand their earlier migration. In my study, interviewees' accounts of their overseas childhoods highlight how many of them had already experienced migration, often on both domestic and international scales. So the experience of leaving home and friends and social networks and reestablishing lives in a new place was familiar before arriving in Australia. Many had already grappled with complex national identities before their emigration to Australia, and this wasn't always tied to prior mobility. One interviewee, for instance, who had Dutch parents and grew up in the Dutch East Indies, had to renegotiate the extent of his belonging to the place of his upbringing when the Indonesian War of Independence began at the end of World War II. This multivalent national identity before migration influenced many interviewees' experiences once they arrived in Australia, in terms of the ease with which and extent to which they were able to relate to established migrant communities in Australia. Later life experiences, as revealed in life story interviews, often enable and empower migrants to make sense of their lives in new ways, whether it's through deep personal reflection from regular therapy or by reclaiming a connection to their cultural communities after previously denying their migrant identities. Life story interviews beautifully illuminate that the way an individual feels about being a migrant is always being recast and recontextualized as people grow and change, and as the communities, cultures, and societies in which they live also change. The final main point I'd like to make is about the value when researching migration history of using oral history interviews that are not explicitly focused on migration. To be clear, I'm not presenting this as an alternative to the important work of collecting and documenting migrants' experiences. Ensuring migrants' voices and experiences are part of the historical record is a major driver of valuable oral history work. And this is work that's done by family historians, migrant community organizations, journalists, activists, artists, and many others too. Recording interviews with migrants is crucial. And I think increasing interview collections in languages other than English, interviewing temporary migrants in Australia, interviewing migrants who once lived in Australia and chose to leave, and interviewing those currently attempting to arrive in Australia are particularly important areas that we as historians should be pursuing. The Behind the Wire project, which records stories with individuals who are detained by the Australian government after seeking asylum, is an example of the really great work being done in this area. And projects like this one push in powerful ways at the boundaries of what constitutes Australian migration experience, and they can reshape public understandings of what it's like to attempt resettlement in Australia. These sorts of collections are vital to future understandings of Australian migration history. But archived oral history interviews that are not focused on migration experience are also valuable sources for studying migration history. It's not just interviews about migration that tell us about migration experience and memory. The Generations Project focused on creating a social history archive of life in Australia during the 20th and early 21st centuries. And while the last section of each interview involved a series of questions about generational identity, most of these 4 to 5 hour life story interviews weren't pursuing a particular topic. About 85 of the 300 interviewees migrated to Australia. And in those interviews, migration is not necessarily assumed to be the central or defining narrative. The interviewees, with input from their interviewers, decided how they wanted to present their migration and the extent to which they would frame their life stories around migration or not. These interviews highlight the aspects of their lived experience that they feel are most important. Some emphasize how formative their migration experience was, but others frame their narratives around other experiences, like growing up overseas during a war. I can't be sure, but I suspect that some of the migrants we interviewed may not have volunteered to participate in a project that was explicitly about migration. In the interviews I've worked with, some explain that they don't identify as a migrant. For some, this is because they see their experiences distinct from dominant narratives about the motivations, experiences, and circumstances of most European migrants who came to Australia during the immediate post-war decades. For others, I think it's about the supposed criminality of individuals seeking asylum that was dominant in political rhetoric when their interviews were being conducted. There are challenges that come with reusing archived interviews that aren't focused on migration. The detail about migration experience varies, although that in itself can be historically illuminating. You can't ask any follow-up questions. But I wonder if working with interviews and collections that aren't explicitly about migration might help historians access a broader range of stories about migration experience and memory. Canadian oral historian Anna Shaftel writes about interviewing survivors of mass violence in Canada and how those interviews were framed. She writes that there is, and I quote, an inherent tension in setting out to interview someone about her or his life as he or she understands it, while being at the same time specifically interested in her or his experience of violence. She goes on to ask, is a life history project that's interested in memories of atrocity necessarily restrictive and directive, no matter how broadly it tries to present itself? So I'll wrap up by returning to the initial question of what can oral history contribute to migration histories? Whether you're recording your own interviews or using existing archives, oral histories offer historians personal, emotional, reflective accounts. These accounts enable us to craft complex stories about migration history that can complicate, enrich, and unsettle dominant narratives about migration. By using oral histories, historians can center migrants' own experiences, words, and crucially, voices in our historical work. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisa. I'm really excited to ask you some more questions about your presentation, but I'll wait till the end. Let me introduce now our final speaker, Dr. Alexandra Dellios. Alex is a lecturer at the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at ANU. Her research considers the public and oral history of migrant and refugee communities in Australia, their experiences of settlement and working and family life. She is the author of Histories of Controversy, Bonegilla Migrant Centre, the editor of Memory and Family in Australian Refugee Histories, and co-editor of Migrant, Multicultural and Diasporic Heritage, Beyond and Between Borders. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I want to first acknowledge that we're all gathered here today on lands that were never ceded by their traditional owners, and pay my respects to them as ongoing custodians of the land. From where I am here in Canberra, the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. So my talk today will do something a little different from Anisa's, but I hope that it will complement what has already been said. So the starting point for this talk was to interrogate, obviously, what oral history can contribute to telling the story of migration and settlement in Australia. And I'm going to do that by exploring that issue with reference to post-war histories of migrant welfare societies, their political engagements, and their contributions to the initial development of early multiculturalism, for want of a better word. So the research project I'll be discussing is broadly interested in community memories of migrant rights activism and protests in the 60s and 70s, and how it interacts with popular and state-sanctioned narratives around multiculturalism today. Focusing on articulations of key groups and individuals, especially welfare societies and workers' leagues, means that we're able to see the work they did in articulating and advocating for one of many different versions of multiculturalism circulating at the time. In one sense, they offer an alternative version because their terms of reference don't accord with current discourses or the model proposed and developed by government from the mid-1970s. The relationships of power that they espoused in these oral histories were subsumed and erased by the state-sanctioned version of multiculturalism that eventuated from the late 70s onwards. So the aim here is to recover one of these alternative versions, recognizing that my access to records and community voices will also shape what versions I can explore. So what these community groups and migrant rights activists came to call multiculturalism was premised on aiding access. It was initially linked to fighting discrimination based on language exclusion and ethnic stereotypes, and underpinned by collective notions of social justice. So they drew on a rhetoric of working class solidarity in which rights was conceived of as welfare rights, as well as drawing on earlier Indigenous civil rights movements circulating from the 1960s onwards. Conventional histories of multiculturalism privilege a top-down perspective. In public discussions, politicians and journalists discuss multiculturalism as a set of policies concerned with the management and containment of diversity by nation states. So in this framing, multiculturalism was, to quote migrant rights activist George Zangalis, discovered and anointed by Graspy and Whitlam from 1975 and put into practice by Fraser and his adoption of recommendations from the 78 Goldbally report. But as Zangalis quips, that's baloney. A reassessment of community archives and most importantly, oral testimonies, rather than only government records, is required. And the aim is to centre minority, so-called minority perspectives, and to use these perspectives to critique dominant discourses and practices associated with state multiculturalism. So for the moment, I've focused on existing oral history collections and publications and records from mainly Greek-speaking migrant groups and welfare societies. The plan for 2020 was to conduct some oral history interviews with older members of the Women's Committee of the Democratist Workers League in Melbourne, which I hope to be able to do next year. So before I go on to talk about some of these oral history collections, I suppose it's useful to just describe this conception of multiculturalism today. Obviously, we know discourses of multiculturalism have functioned in a neoliberal socio-political framework, and it's a logic that privileges universal values of progress and consumption. In this framing, difference is a symbolic performance by ethnics, and they become visible as a market-driven commodity rather than something requiring social care and with social needs. So concurrently, the discourse around social justice and the right to welfare and the class dialect of an earlier era has obviously changed substantially since the 1970s. This earlier language of liberation that sought to dismantle racism as a structure which also extends to those anti-racism and anti-colonial movements, which have been, as many academics have argued here and in the UK, rerouted by a language of more limited civil rights and the granting of these by the state. So these are models of liberal multiculturalism that don't challenge fundamental structures of society and its racist underpinnings. So listening to oral histories in this context, in the present, then becomes a matter of listening both intersubjectively and dialogically. So in order to hear the discourse of migrant rights, as it was conceived, one needs to be open to the possibility of alternative versions and visions, as well as emotions associated with multiculturalism in that era. So the version these activists offered, as I've argued, have been superseded by a present and depoliticized version of diversity, versions that continue to perpetuate the myth of harmonious settlement in this country. So the migrant rights movement had its genesis in left-wing workers' groups. Many, like the Democratist League and the Atlas League, align themselves with the Communist Party of Australia. And we get a sense of these shifting and complex alliances when listening to oral history testimonies. And my research began firstly by looking at a few collections in the National Library. Today, I'll just be talking about the Unwanted Australians Oral History Collection, which was initiated actually in 2017 in the wake of an SBS investigative report. And the other ones are, well, the obvious ones are the Greek Australian Oral History and Folklife collection, which was created in the 90s in order to fill gaps in the National Library's collection by adding ethnic voices. So I only have time to focus on the Unwanted Australians collection for now. So these whole of life interviews provide a wide context for their activists' work. Their work in campaigning for better services for migrant cohorts and for changes to the structure and practice of trade unions and employers, in addition to their transnational social justice advocacy. So we can see how their life experiences were tied up with the access and equity debates of the era. Contrary to many black and white assessments of the migrant-led services area, which kind of pits more integrationist approaches represented by David Cox's more church-based ecumenical migration centre against more radical approaches represented perhaps by the Fitzroy Ecumenical Centre and the Communist Party of Australia, as well as sort of pitting ethnic against ethnic, these oral histories and associated documentation from community organisations demonstrate a more complex web of relations, collaborations and loose ideologies. These groups, in addition to militant left-wing trade unions in Victoria and the previously mentioned Democratist League and Atlas League and respective leagues in Newcastle, Brisbane and Adelaide, as well as the Italian Federation of Migrant Workers and their families, and even ethnic representatives from within the Victorian branch of the Anglo-Australian Good Neighbour Council. They all collaborated on publications and reports, attended one another's seminar series, and lobbied government together. So key among their positions, which didn't always align, was that migrant problems were working class problems. While key organisations define themselves according to ethnically aligned language groups, migrant rights activists also stressed class-based interests. And Zangalis, in reflecting on his arrival from Greece, stated in his interview, "How little we realise when we came to Australia, the Turkish workers, the Italian workers, we were cursing the same bosses in our own languages. We had so much in common, even in culture." End quote. As Nikolakopoulos and Vasiliakopoulos identified in regards to the Democratist League, of which Zangalis was a member, a shared ethnicity was never enough to unite members. They had an internationalist understanding of workers' solidarity. And like other Greek workers' leagues established in Australia in the 1930s, they had clear political ideologies that extended to issues beyond insular community politics. And they attempted to make connections with the broader Australian labour movement, and other migrant groups from non-English speaking backgrounds, recognising that they constituted nearly 30% of the workforce by the early 1970s, and that they were concentrated in the heaviest, dirtiest, most monotonous, dangerous and least paid jobs. So we can see, just even by glancing at some of these testimonies, that they go against the grain of more nationalist and celebratory conceptions of multiculturalism as bound by the nation state. The Democritus and Atlas League also demonstrated at respective consulates in Australia against dictatorships in Greece and Cyprus throughout the 60s and the 70s. Obviously, the Communist Party of Australia became a natural home for many migrant rights activists at a time when the Australian Labor Party policy platform still upheld the White Australia policy. So the Communist Party's embrace of this ethnic factor saw the emergence of Greek branches of the Communist Party, and this relationship enabled the migrant workers movement to make much headway. And when discussing the nature of the Democritus League's relationship with the Communist Party in the 60s and the 70s, Zangalis and others within the collection argued that they wanted the same thing. He and others in this collection also suggest that the migrants who found themselves part of this organised working class were shaped by their experiences fighting fascism and Nazism during the occupation of their home countries in World War II, which is an argument we can unpack later if you like. In his oral history testimony, Zangalis repeatedly stresses the importance of the 1973 Migrant Workers' Conference, held by the Fitzroy Ecumenical Centre in Melbourne. And as the previous slide indicated, this conference aimed to raise the question of rights of and I'm quoting here, non-Anglo-Saxon migrants to participate more fully in all aspects of the social, cultural, economic and political life of present-day Australia, as well as exploring injustice and discrimination against ethnic groups by those institutions. All speakers within this conference stressed that this required the involvement of migrants themselves and directly condemned the government's paternalistic and patronising approach to migrant welfare. They cited a lack of consultation with migrant groups and poor representation on government-appointed or supported groups, which included the Good Neighbour Council and the Australian Council of Social Services. I put up a pretty lengthy quote from Zangalis on the screen there, in which he uses the memory of the Migrant Workers' Conference in particular as a starting point to argue that migrant workers played a very important role in making welfare demands of the state, and he attributes the development of key ideas within the Australian labour movement to migrant workers, which were shared across the 73 and 75 migrant workers conferences. So here, in this quote, at least, Zangalis stresses the agency of the ethnic group to which he belongs, obviously, as well as working migrants more generally. Groups which have been structurally marginalised and excluded from most considerations of Australian labour history. A lot of mainstream political history has been blind to the contribution of other Australians to the development of unions and working class politics. So overall, these testimonies also indicate that the activities of ethnically aligned workers groups are much broader and outward looking than first thought, or at least the memories associated with this era are concerned with broader social justice issues beyond the Greek communities of inner Melbourne or Sydney. So like Zangalis, Stratos Mavrantonis joined the Communist Party of Australia also through the Greek Workers' League, the Atlas League in Sydney. Like the Democritus League, the Atlas League also provided services to migrants, including translation, interpretation, help navigating the legal and health systems in Australia, and help finding employment and accommodation. So they supported, where unions failed to, collective action in factory workplaces and by workers in assembly plants at Ford and Holden in the 70s and the 80s. They also published and distributed materials that tried to communicate to Greek migrants their rights as workers and migrants. But as Mavrantonis explains, the issues that the Atlas League tackled were not confined to the needs of Greek migrants in Sydney. nor were they isolated from the other migrant and social justice causes that were at the heart of this welfare society. So another quote there from an interview in the collection about their kind of outward-looking approach and advocacy on behalf of struggles in Cyprus and democracy in Greece in the 60s and 70s. So obviously their alternative versions of multiculturalism were one among many circulating throughout the 70s and the 80s, which have faded from today's discussions. But I think we can still hear their versions of collective action, those premised on aiding access and rejecting state paternalism, in some of these new and old oral history collections. And here I've consciously read these activist lives in ways that contribute to wider understandings of the social history of the migrant rights period, conscious too of the ways in which that period is remembered and forgotten today, both individually and collectively. And perhaps rescuing these research strains, embracing that interpretive dissonance at the heart of reanalysis of oral histories, the distinctive perspectives they offer, can have purchase for current and future discussions around how we imagine multiculturalism functioning. Obviously, there's a lot more historical work to be done on the political actions of, for want of a better word, non-English speaking migrants across this period in order to make sense of the context in which they worked, the stereotypes they worked against, and the collective and personal pasts they brought with them to Australia. It must be stressed there is obviously a lot more oral history work left to be done in this area as well, and this could include revisiting older oral history collections with new questions in mind. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I have lots of questions. I might actually ask one of Alex just because it's following on from what you were talking about. And I was hoping, could you just tell us a little bit more about the presence of migrant activists' voices in these existing oral history collections? I know you didn't get to really talk at length, but can you speak a little bit more about that?
In existing oral history collections, is that what you are?
Yep.
Well, I was quite lucky to come across this very small oral history collection that was, as I said, only formed in 2017 off the back of that SBS investigative report into post-war migrants that were subject to ASIO surveillance in this 1950s to the 1970s because of their left-wing political activity. That was the starting point for that SBS investigation and the impetus behind the formation of that oral history collection. There's not a lot in there at the moment, and I think they've run out of funding to do any more oral histories. And sadly, a lot of those older activists are passing away. So we have lost a lot of those voices, and they're generally not voices that you would find in larger elitist national cultural collecting institutions like the National Library, which I guess is Anisa's point about perhaps searching more broadly across different oral history collections, not just ones that focus explicitly on the migrant journey. There's definitely value in doing that, and I'd love to revisit some of those earlier collections, oral history projects that were conducted in the 70s and the 80s, including Morag Lowe's work with FILIF, the Italian Federation for Migrant Workers and Their Families, the work she did in the 1970s, alongside, I think, a bit of work done with the Ethnic Communities Council in New South Wales, which I think is also held by the State Library of New South Wales. But there's definitely still quite a lot of work to be done. And as I said, I had hoped to interview some people within the Democratist League this year, but maybe I'll get to do it next year.
Are these people that had already been interviewed and you're going back to ask them more questions?
Well, not people that have already been interviewed, and this would be obvious to anyone listening, are mainly men. The people I did want to speak to were members of the Women's Committee of the Democratus League who were actually quite involved with their unions and with many of workplace disputes in the 70s and the 80s in Melbourne, and have a lot of stories they want to share, just judging off some of the conversations I've had with them, but they don't appear in the same way that some of their male compatriots do in the archive. So, yeah.
Might just see if Anisa can turn her camera on so we can. There you are. Hello. I have a question that's for both of you, and I'm sure you'll have different opinions on it or bring different aspects to it, but I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about this process of secondary analysis in archived interviews and looking at them for more than what they were originally recorded for, to see what else you can find.
Well, I really love what Alex ended with that idea of, you know, you're very conscious that you're going back and you're asking different questions of material that was recorded for a very specific purpose that differs from your own research interests. And that can be really excruciating at times when you hear a potential line of questioning not being followed up because it's not the primary purpose, it's just what you want to hear. But I also think that the lack of detail can sometimes be really illuminating. A couple of interviews I've worked with come to mind where when people have migrated elsewhere, they talk in huge detail about what those migration experiences were like, but migrating to Australia gets very little attention. And, you know, that in itself is interesting to kind of interrogate. So I think you end up reframing how you think about the presence or absence of detail. Absence becomes super important. I guess the other thing that happens, for me at least, is because you have to listen so deeply because you don't have this relationship with the person, because you didn't interview them, you don't come in listening with the kind of preconceptions you leave an interview with. When you leave an interview you've done, I feel like you go away with a sense of the person, a sense of the interview, and you bring that with you when you come back to listen to the interview. And so I think you end up having to listen really, really deeply because you're wondering what every pause might mean. Yeah, just there's so much imaginative work almost that you have to do when you're listening deeply and transcribing those interviews if you know, they don't have transcripts available already. And it sort of makes me think of how I think early in the 2000s, Michael Frisch wrote something, I'm paraphrasing, but he was essentially saying, you know, the deep, dark secret of oral history is that no one goes back and listens to the interview. And so I quite enjoy that Alex and I are both talking about projects that are doing that. So I think with collections like the Generations one, which are so large, we recorded, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but it was almost 1,500 hours of interviews and, you know, spent years recording those. I think you end up with a bit of an ethical imperative to think about. You don't want these interviews just sat on shelves gathering dust. You do want people to be working with them in new and different ways and asking new questions. So it feels like a lovely opportunity to be able to do that too.
It's funny, while it's important to keep collecting and conducting interviews, there's a lot that's already there that maybe isn't being used. And it can be frustrating, especially if you have that whole of life structure. It still ends up being a choose your own adventure because you do sometimes wish, oh, if you'd just gone down that avenue of questioning and asked them one more question, it would have given you a completely different outcome from what you're getting from it. But it's this like ephemeral thing. You can't go back. You only have that one version. And sometimes, or often, the silences are just as powerful as what's being spoken. It's the gaps in between and the pauses, which are quite telling. Yeah.
Can I just say, Maria, it's a very different experience, skill, to be analysing your own oral history interviews that you've conducted, to to the process of doing it with other people's interviews. And I mean, historians do this all the time, but it's not, in the oral history literature at least, it's not something that's explicitly talked about enough. I think that actual process of analysis of that, I suppose, raw data, but other people's data, and what kind of questions we're asking of that, not just as oral historians, but as historians, and what kind of different subject positions we have to negotiate in doing that. And I drew quite heavily on ideas from like Catherine Borland and Joanna Bornat, who talk a lot about conducting early oral histories in the 1970s and revisiting that women's histories as how to construct feminist histories, and the different questions they had to ask of some of their interviewees, and some of the subject positions they posed at an earlier moment in time. But also what you do when perhaps your reading or your analysis doesn't accord with what your interviewee has offered, and I suppose the dissonance that emerges from that relationship, which can be part of that analysis, I suppose. But I guess what I'm saying is that we need to be open to negotiating many different subject positions, and it can be quite tricky, but very exciting and rewarding.
Do you build up what you're trying to get? Sometimes you might not get it from one interview, but there is a weird trend if you listen to a few. And so even if one interview didn't really give you what you were hoping, it gave you a little snippet. But then listening to subsequent ones, you're like, okay, there's enough here to form an opinion or to really go down this direction, even if it wasn't like really spelt out in one interview. You never get those perfect sound bites where everything is encapsulated. You're like, that's it. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Does that happen? Or is it just really just tiny little fragments spread across many, many interviews?
Anisa, do you want to go with that one?
I suppose I'm lucky in that all my interviews I've chosen to work with them because they all have, you know, a story about youth migration to Australia involved. So I know I'm going to get some version of that. So there are none that I've worked with that have zero details about what I'm looking for in them. So I suppose I've been lucky in that regard. Something I just got to thinking about when Alex was talking about subject positions, which I completely agree with, and it's a really tricky thing to, I think, add into your interpretation because it's so vital, and yet it's a very important and different point to often the main topic you're writing about. So I find that a really interesting but challenging balance to manage. But it also introduces this new time period into the interview where, you know, you normally, if you're doing your own interviews, you've got the time of the experience and the time of the remembering, but you've also got the time of the creation of the archive, which becomes really different often. I think Alex's experience talking about the sort of changing ideas of multiculturalism really demonstrates that too, that you've got the time of experience, the time of the remembering, and then the time at which you're working in it. So it's really rich in that regard, but it sort of crosses more a wider time period as well.
I think you've both touched on it. I'm just going to ask again in case there's anything else you want to add, but really the context and the aims of the oral history collections that your current research is drawing on. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
Do you want to go, Alex?
Sure. You can just take turns.
Well, the two collections I've focused on are they're very different, and not just in terms of the time period, a context in which they were created. I mean, I've already spoken about the Unwanted Australians collection, but the interesting thing about that is the interviewer is a journalist who's primarily concerned in this kind of political moment in these men's lives, and she kind of heaps a lot of importance and expectation on that key moment, which is their the government's refusal of their citizenship applications. But you can see in across all the interviews in the collection, them kind of resisting that interpretation of their lives, as they prefer to kind of talk about their political activism more holistically and not, I suppose, not take on a sense of victimhood, and to recognise their own, I suppose, privilege in relation to the broader social justice issues that they've been campaigning for their whole lives. And that is really the value of a life story interview, which really comes across in that collection and is quite valuable for that reason. The other collection I'd kind of tapped into was one created in the 90s, as I mentioned, which is a really part of a push from a lot of cultural collecting institutions at that time, I think, to kind of insert the ethnic voice into a lot of national collections or state collections, just in recognition that perhaps non-Anglo-Australian voices were lacking, which they were and they still are. But they're framed in a particular way that really tries to bring out perhaps more static conceptions of ethnic identity. Like the ones in the Greek Australian Oral History and Folk Life collection are interesting just because of the questions they pose and the questions they don't pose. And the questions in particular that they pose to women in that they're always asked about what it means for you to be Greek, and in particular, the conception of the Greek housewife, which speaks to a particular moment in time and a particular generation, but also kind of a perhaps static conception of what we think of as ethnic identity today. And it's of its time, but it does have value for me, for any researcher today, approaching these oral history collections again for different purposes. And in my case, that would be looking for alternative visions of or articulations of multiculturalism in the 70s.
Anisa, do you have any?
I suppose with the Generations project, I was involved in the creation of it, so I guess I was quite across its aims from the get-go. And one of the aims I think is interesting in terms of going back to secondary analysis, your original question, is how it was designed for secondary analysis, and that's probably aided my experience a fair bit. You know, there's a lot of documentation of expressions of interest and feedback forms and interviewers' reflections, and so there's a whole lot of material that kind of supports the interview that that helps. And I suppose that its primary aim was to create a social history archive. And while Generations was kind of the string that tied it all together, it was really looking for a diversity of lived experience. And I think its broad remit has made it really interesting for secondary analysis as well. But you certainly get a sense of each interviewer's really unique style that they would bring to the interview, given how broad the remit was. And, you know, you can see some of the things that Alex was mentioning about how even working with interviews now that were conducted in 2011, it's really clear that that's a different country and it's a different time and a different place.
I have one more question, which I guess I should have asked at the beginning, because you could basically have a whole session around this, but it's the use of language. Were the interviews that you came across conducted in other languages? Was the interviewer also speaking the same language? Did you have to rely on, maybe for Alex's older ones, on translations or transcriptions? Were sometimes the interviewees using English when it may not have been the language they were the most confident in expressing their story in? Could you just speak really briefly about any experiences you've had with language or multi-language interviews?
Yeah, a lot of the earlier interviews in the Greek Australians collection were actually conducted in Greek. And as you know, Maria, my Greek is woeful. So I struggled, and they didn't have translations of those actually. They just had very brief summaries. So I struggled, I mean, I did struggle through those. My level of Greek is not fantastic, but...
You'd struggle anyways, because sometimes some Greek accents and dialects are just very difficult to understand, even if you are very comfortable. And I imagine other languages are the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were actually a variety of different dialects and spread across that collection. The other ones, the more recent ones, because Christina Kokolia, the journalist who conducted the interviews, was conducted them in English. There were, yeah, all in English, but I became weirdly obsessed with little odd turns of phrase that some of these Greek men would use, and try to figure out what the literal translation from Greek to English was and why they did that. Yeah, that's just something I found myself doing, but yeah.
I know, it's a whole session on its own, like it's just a minefield, but I just was so curious because we're talking about migrants and migrant communities. There's bound to be a lot of stuff that's maybe switching back and forth, or maybe it's a conscious choice for interviewees to speak English because they want to make a statement that now they're here, or they want people to understand them and they want to speak English.
And you should always be able to give people the opportunity to narrate their lives in the language that they prefer. But then there's the other issue of accessibility, right? And how do you alleviate that? Transcription can only go so far. I was listening to one interview, can't remember what collection it was a part of, but it was an elderly Italian-speaking man who had his son with him. Even though he could speak English, it was kind of heavily accented to the point where his son would kind of have to jump in every now and then. But also his kind of way of speech didn't exactly, and we've all had this experience, not only did it not translate in the transcription, but it just almost didn't make sense as written words. You really had to actually listen to it. Anyway, I'll let Anisa talk now. Sorry.
We've just got like 1 minute left, and I feel like this is probably a session we could put into next year's History Matters, because yeah, there's a lot to cover.
Absolutely. It's such a good question, though, and I think it's an area that, you know, oral history collections in Australia generally, just, it would be great to see more and more multilingual ones. I think there's a dearth of that, really. The Generations Project did conduct some in Dinka and Russian, but all the ones I'm working with are in English. But I do think that even within that, there's really interesting linguistic exchanges. I was listening to an interview with a young man from Germany recently, and you know, you can see how the interviewer is learning phrases and words about his childhood in German, and just the decisions he's making about what to say in German and what to say in English. And you know, the interviewer saying, okay, have I got that word right? Obviously it's very different to if he had done the whole interview in German, but I think even if you do an interview just in English, language does still play a role, and there can be some really interesting complex stuff happening within that.
Absolutely. I just want to wrap up really quickly before I hand over to Rachel. Thank you both so much. I'm absolutely thrilled we're ending History Matters for 2020 on a very strong oral history note with you both tonight. But I do want to take a moment to thank everyone that's worked on putting this together and making it a reality, particularly collaborating between Oral History New South Wales and PHA. I was so privileged to work with Dr. Lisa Murray, Professor Paula Hamilton, Minna Mullen-Schultz, who really brought their expertise, energy and enthusiasm to developing this monthly program. As you can see, was incredibly stimulating and diverse, and really highlighted and examined the role of historians and oral history. We've had 27 speakers and chairs. I want to thank all of them. I really would love to thank my colleagues at the State Library, particularly Rachel, and of course the State Library for their support and generosity in hosting us, both in person and online. We're really grateful, and we've noticed since going online, we've really opened up to way more people than we could have ever fit into a room. So we're really thankful for that, and we hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as we have. So just wanted to say a quick thank you because it's our last one of the year, and thank you both. And I'll hand it over to Rachel now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, yes, to all the organisations who have helped pull this together. It's been a fabulous season, and a special shout out to my colleagues in public programs, particularly Jade McLaughlin, who wrangles all of us and all of the technology and actually makes sure that every episode works. We'll be back with more programming next year, but if you would like more history, there is a special curator talk this Friday online at 1 p.m, protest posters. It's always a good time to pick up your knowledge on protest, so do join us for that. And if you would like to do another bit of history on a Wednesday, then on the 2nd of December at History Matters time at 5:30 p.m, do join us at the library for a very special public lecture. Professor Mark Ledbury will be asking what price the humanities, and he'll be unpacking some of the debate of the value of counting the value of humanities, which is often contested, but he talks about it in a way that encourages all of us to prize our humanities in society. So after what has been a bit of a rough year for humanities scholars, please join us for that very important lecture. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you next time for Your Library at Home. Good night.